our work. For example, how do analysts and authorities share insights with customers or general population? Today, to tell us about their lesson learned using R as a platform to enable digital communication in an effective way, we have Andrew Collier from Fathom Data and Joe Adams from the Scottish Government. So Andrew runs a data science consultancy, Fathom Data, and is here to present his package Emaily, which is a library for easily sending emails from R. And Joe is currently focused on making official statistics at National Records Scotland more impactful and accessible. It will guide us through the design process of a public-facing dashboard developed to build transparency and public engagement about COVID-19 data. Now, for those of you who are not new to our meetups, you will have noticed that there has been a change in platform. So let me give the stage to Greg for a few moments. We will give some details about it. Greg, it's all yours.
Hi, folks. Hopefully you're picking this up on Element. I just fixed an issue with the embedding, which means it wasn't embedding properly in the Element client. So apologies for those people who are in the Matrix room right now. I'm just going to start the stream right now, which means, yep, I can hear myself. That's great. So the way we're doing this is a little bit different. It's an experiment. So the chat will be in our new Matrix room. I say new, we created it in June. And that's where we're going to handle all the Q&A, all of the discussion. And the reason is so that it's persistent, so that we can continue the debate after the talk. We don't lose all of that lovely discussion at the end of the hour. And we can chat on throughout the coming time and then reuse that again next month and so on. So if you don't already have a Matrix account, please go and sign up for one. You can use matrix.org or any other Matrix provider. It is a decentralized platform. You can join the room at #EdinbR:/matrix.org. And from there, you can watch the talk right now live in the room if you're on the standard Element client. That's at app.element.io or just on YouTube if you prefer. I look forward to seeing you in the chat room. I will be moderating tonight, so I will be happily taking your questions there and passing them on to our speakers. I'm very much looking forward to the talks, everyone.
Excellent. Thanks, Greg. So we're ready to start. Just a few housekeeping rules. The speakers will take questions after the talks at the end of it all. Feel free to drop any questions you may want to ask in the Matrix chat. In the meantime, we will collate them and then deliver them to the speakers at the end. Okay, so our first speaker for tonight is Andrew. Andrew, the stage is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. Let me just get my screen shared. Okay, so email is a really old technology. It's been around in roughly in its present form since the 1970s, and not an awful lot has changed. It's stable and robust and reliable. However, in the interim, a lot of other messaging technologies have evolved, and the most notable amongst these are probably WhatsApp and Telegram. However, with all of these other options available, it's worth wondering whether email is still relevant, and in my opinion, it most certainly is. And there are a number of reasons for that. It's extremely pervasive. There are hundreds of billions, of emails being sent every day. It's very accessible. Essentially, the majority of people have access to email if they want to. And it's very versatile. You can attach a wide range of different content into an email message. So despite its age, email is still a pretty sexy technology. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for everything that originates in the 1970s. So good evening. I'm Andrew Collier, and I'm originally from South Africa, as you might tell from my accent. I've recently moved to the UK, and I'm staying in Berkshire. I'm interested in a bunch of different technologies, and I also like to run. So as was mentioned earlier, I work for a fully remote data science consulting company called Fathom Data. We're originally based in South Africa, and we work with clients in Africa, Europe, Australia, and the US. This is our little team. We're a very mixed bunch, spread across 3 continents and 5 countries. We're also diverse in our backgrounds and skill sets, and over the last few years, we've gained a lot of experience across the entire spectrum of data science projects. We do a lot of web scraping, we build a lot of databases, and we also do a bunch of automated reporting. And for this, email is our preferred medium. And as a result of the fact that we use email quite a lot, we've developed the email package for R. The name email, which I think is probably not the best choice of name because it's a little bit difficult to pronounce or foreign, is actually a misspelling of the Zulu word for email. Now, the design goals for this package were that ideally we want it to work with all SMTP servers, or all email servers indeed, if possible, and that it should require a minimal set of dependencies, or at least no complicated dependencies. And if you've ever had trouble installing R Java, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. So the popularity of the package is slowly growing over time. In an absolute sense, the numbers of downloads per month are pretty paltry, but we're getting there. It's definitely gaining in popularity. So let's take a look at what's involved in sending a message. So considering either an email message or just a plain letter. Well, there are three core components. There's the envelope, or in the case of an email, the header information. There's the letter itself, the email body, and then there's the delivery system, or a network of email servers. But for any of those to make sense, we also need to have at least two parties involved. So somebody to send the message and somebody to receive the message. And these are specified as addresses, and these addresses will provide a name of sorts. It may not be a real person's name, and a location or a domain of each of the communicating parties, the sender and the receiver. Now, in the case of email, these addresses are captured as address objects, and these can be created either using a constructor or a coercer, so using the as address function. And both of these functions are able to handle addresses in a variety of different formats. Now, they're also fairly flexible in the sense that, excuse me, they will allow you to create multiple addresses at the same time. So, for example, you can specify a single domain and then a bunch of different local names at that domain, and you'll get a corresponding vector of addresses being supplied. Now, one of the things that we've found working with client data is that often email addresses can be fairly grubby. The formatting is not necessarily particularly good. You know, people are typing in their email addresses just to get through a series of forms. So they're not necessarily particularly diligent in making sure that they are accurate and correct. So the functions that accept email addresses will do some elementary cleaning up. So they will remove white space, and they will also clean up any other things that are sort of obviously malformed. There's also a compliant function, and this will actually determine whether an email address is syntactically valid, and it will reject anything that doesn't sort of conform to what is required for an email address. So you can use this for pre-filtering your address list before you actually start issuing emails out to the server. Okay, so let's move on to the next ingredient, and this is the envelope. So the packaging for our message, and the envelope specifies two things. So on the front of the envelope, you've got who the letter or the email is going to, and then generally on the back, if you're kind of old school, then you'll also have your address details, who sent the message. And the same applies in an email, right? You've got a to field and a from field at the very minimum. Now, the envelope is also the container for the message itself. So you can think of like the header of your email actually as being kind of a container for the content. So in the email, we will construct an envelope literally by calling the envelope constructor. And in a simple case, you would provide it with the to and from addresses for the email. But there are a couple of ways of doing this. You can also just create a blank envelope, so an empty envelope object, and then add in the to and from information after the fact. And here you can see that I've actually used the two address variables that I created a few slides back, rather than having the explicit email address fields. As you would expect from like a well-formed S3 class, there is a print method, and printing one of these envelope objects will give you back the header information. So you can see that you've got the to field and the from field, and a couple of other bits of information have been injected into the header as well. So you can see that there's a date in the first field, as well as the version of MIME, because we're going to ultimately be using MIME for embedding different types of content in the email. And then there's also the ex-mailer field, and we're using that to identify the emailee as the client of origin for these emails. So it's got both the name of the package as well as the version that was used to create the message. We found that has been pretty useful in our initial rounds of testing with package, just in terms of debugging things when they break. At least we know exactly which version of the package was used to create a particular email. So in addition to the from and the to fields, you probably also want to include a subject, what the email is about, and the subject can actually be supplied as an additional argument to the constructor. But, and I find this to be the more flexible approach, you can also use the subject method to basically just tag on a subject to the email as you kind of build it up iteratively in this pipeline. So once you've introduced the subject, then that subject field will also appear within the header of the email. Now, you can also pop in additional recipients. So CC fields and BCC can also be supplied. And in this case, you can see that there are a couple of ways that you can provide these additional email addresses. So the one is to simply have a string of addresses, a single string where each address is separated by a comma, or alternatively, you can provide them as a series of arguments to any of these functions. So they're fairly flexible in terms of how these addresses can be supplied. Once you've actually assembled the basic structure for your envelope with all the various recipients, you can use the parties function to basically break down who the people are involved. And you can see that the information you get back from this is a rather nice kind of breakdown of each of the fields in the header, giving the display name for each of the parties, if that's been provided, along with their email address, and then the two different components of that email address, their local name as well as the domain. And so this can be used with your normal sort of tool set for processing data frames or tables, to filter and select various bits of information about a specific email message. Okay, so let's move on to the body of the email itself. Two types of email body are supported: text and HTML. The text body is supplied via the text method, and you simply provide an argument, which is the body of the message, and that is then inserted into the body of the email. You can also specify HTML, and in the case of HTML, you could either specify literally verbatim HTML as an argument, or alternatively a file name for a HTML file that lives on disk and which you're going to load into R when you're generating the email. And again, the HTML content is then inserted into the email. Now, as you might expect, if you're going to create a nice email with some illustrations in it, then you'd want to embed some images, perhaps. So you can provide base64 encoded images directly into that body of the email. But we're going to see a little bit later that there are more flexible ways of actually injecting content like images into an email. Since we're talking about base 64 encoding, it makes sense to mention that we can also insert arbitrary attachments into the email, and we do this via the attachment method, simply providing as an argument the name of the file that you're wanting to attach, and then the body of that file is automatically base 64 encoded and inserted into a component of the email. Now, there's also a rather esoteric related feature which relates to attaching contents to the body of a message, and that is by using a content ID. And this is relevant to a new feature which we're just about to release in email. But basically, the idea here is that if you're wanting to embed an image into an email, HTML email, then rather than embedding that image directly into the body of the HTML, you provide the image as a separate attachment, and then you reference that image from the body of your email. And the way that is done is by having a CID argument to the image tag within the email. And that CID then references the CID in the attachment. So this is the way that the email client will tie up the attachments to the corresponding kind of placeholders in the email body, and that will then insert them in the right place. And the way that this looks in the corresponding email, well, things are now getting a little bit complicated. We've actually got a MIME document here with two separate components. The one is the body of the HTML, and you can see over there that it references the CID of the image. And then below it over here is the actual base 64 encoded image itself. In your normal email client, you wouldn't actually see all of these details. What you would simply see is a nicely formatted HTML document with the image inserted into the right place. Okay, the final sort of part of the recipe then is the delivery system. So getting the email from your machine to the recipient's machine. And here I'm going to reference Isaac Newton, who was a prodigiously successful scientist, and a lot of his success was based on the fact that he leveraged work that was done by numerous other scientists. And taking a leaf out of his book, email also benefits from functionality that has been implemented in a bunch of other packages. In fact, without which it would be impossible to do what we have done. Notable amongst these is the very excellent curl package by Jeroen Ooms, and which actually facilitates the interaction between email and the SMTP server. So the way that this is set up is by calling the server function, and to that you need to provide a couple of bits of information. One is the details of the host, which is typically going to be some a DNS entry like smtp.gmail.com. Optionally a port. If you don't provide a port, then it's going to default to port 25. And then a username and a password, which I will normally just store in an environment variable so that I don't need to embed them explicitly into a script. And then that function, the server function, actually returns a closure, and that closure then embeds the information that you provided as the arguments. And that closure can then be used to actually dispatch the email. So we've created a message object, an envelope, and we then just provide that as an argument to the closure, which is then dispatched to the SMTP server. There are a couple of nice features associated with this. You can either choose to leave the verbose logging off, in which case it will simply get sent to the server and return immediately and silently. Alternatively, you can turn debug verbose logging on, in which case you'll see all of the details of the interaction with the server, which can be very handy if you're debugging issues with that interaction. You can also, by default, the connection with the server will be persistent. And this will mean that if you're sending a series of email messages, then you don't need to initiate a new connection for each of those. And this means that the whole process can be a lot quicker. And finally, the closure itself actually employs exponential backoff. And this means that if there is an error during the communication with the server, then it will retry at progressively longer delays until it eventually gives up, throws its hands up. Okay, so shall we do a quick demo? Let me just see if I can sort out the logistics for this. Right, I'm going to just rearrange things a bit. I'm going to just check if you can see my RStudio. Yeah. Okay, looks like you can. Right, so I'll make this a bit bigger so that you can see it too. And just run you through the body of this quick script. So what I've got here is just loading up the package and then creating a connection to an SMTP server. In this case, I'm just using the service at SMTP bucket, which is basically like a black hole into which you can send emails when you're testing a system like this. It works on port 8025, and I'm specifying a username and no password required. Then creating a simple envelope with a sender and a recipient, adding in a subject, as well as a body, and then an attachment. And that attachment is just a PNG file. And then finally, then using the server closure to send the email. And now I'm going to just source that file and hold thumbs. So this is what it looks like. Then I've got verbose logging turned on, so we can see all of the details of the interaction with the server. So there's messages going back and forth between the client and the server, and then finally the whole process is completed. And we can then pop across to SMTP buckets and just confirm that that email has indeed been delivered. There we go. So on SMTP bucket, we can just specify who sent the message. So there's Jenny, and let's search for her. And there you go. So there's the message that we've just sent, the dreaded red dot. And there are the contents that we've just seen in RStudio. So that seems to work rather nicely. Right, let me flip back to the slides. And, okay, so that was just sending a simple email. What about doing something a little bit more interesting, a mail merge? So sending a bunch of emails to different recipients and personalizing each of those individual messages. Well, to do this, we're going to take advantage of the fact that behind the scenes, Emaili is using another very cool package, which is Glue, and it's using that to perform a variable interpolation into strings. So, for example, if you create a variable with somebody's name, you can then interpolate that name into the body of the email by using this double braces notation. Normally in Glue, it's just a single brace, but we're using double braces just to make things a little bit more flexible. You can change that delimiter if you want. And the result is that you have an email where Bob's name has now been inserted into the body, the text body. So we can now scale this up to send out emails to multiple people and ensure that each of those emails is then customized for them individually. So for example, if I have a tibble with columns for names and emails, I can start off by creating a generic envelope object, just specifying the person who's sending all of these emails. And then using pwalk from the per package, I can iterate over each of the records in that tibble. And for each one, I specify using the to method, what the address is of the person that I'm sending the message to, and then I'm going to actually interpolate their individual names into the body of the message. So they each are getting something that's personalized, and then finally sending it off via the same server. So let's demo this as well. Once again, going back to RStudio, and this time the mail merge. So very much the same as what you just seen on the slides. We're we've got the loading a couple of packages, but now bringing in dplyr and per, setting up the server, so using SMTP bucket once again, and then creating a tibble with the names and the emails of the various parties, an envelope specifying who's sending the email addresses, and then iterating over each of the recipients, and for each of them using in their actual name in the subject line, and inserting their address in the body of the email. I completely admit that this is a very inane message to send to anyone, but it works for illustration purposes. So let's run that. And then we can go back to SMTP bucket and validate that it has been delivered. So jenny@gmail.com. Oh, it's not Jenny, is it? Who is it? Google.com. Beg your pardon. Okay, so there we have messages sent to Bob and Aaron and Wendy. The subject of the messages contains each of their individual names, and if we click through on one of them, then the body of the message also contains their email. And of course, you don't just need to use, you can use other information to be interpolated into the body of the message, right? It doesn't need to just be names and email addresses. It could be anything else that you just pack into another column in your table before you start creating the emails. Okay, so that more or less brings me to the conclusion of my talk. There's actually a new feature which we are going to be rolling out either tomorrow or on Friday, and I'm going to be giving a talk for the Birmingham R group tomorrow evening, actually, and I'll be covering a lot of the same ground that I've spoken about this evening, but also talking about some new features which I think are very cool and are really very, very useful if you're doing automated reporting. So if you have time tomorrow evening and you wouldn't mind hearing me drone on about emails again, it would be great to have you there. The slides for this talk are available at this link. These are my contact details. If you'd like to chat about emaili or anything else related to R or data in general, then please get in touch. And finally, just want to acknowledge contributions from a couple of other folk on my team who helped me put this talk together. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Andrew. Very interesting talk. So without further ado, let's move on to our next speaker, Joseph.
Hi there. I'm just going to share my screen.
The floor is yours.
Okay. Can you see that okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so hello, my name is Joe, and I work in National Records of Scotland, or NRS for short. NRS does things like Scotland's census and various other official statistics around demography. And my team is we're a team of 2 statisticians, and we produce our own statistics, but we also focus on improving the reach and the impact of statistics produced by other statisticians. So that means things like plain English, usability, and getting into more user engagement as well. We'll also have a bit of a background in infographics and interactive data visualizations as well. So this presentation is about a project that I was brought into in kind of early May 2020 to build a kind of a public-facing dashboard to bring together a lot of the evidence that ministers were using at the time to make decisions about the pandemic. So the goal was really to improve transparency around those decisions and build some public engagement as well. It was very much a team effort, so I was sort of the main one writing the R code, but the data and the narrative came from possibly at least 10 teams across the Scottish Government. We also got feedback on the dashboard from other statisticians, and some people directly helped by writing some code as well. I've since moved on from this project, so some people are still maintaining it. We had a bit of help from other people around web analytics and hosting. So it is me talking about it, but it was very much a team effort, and there's a lot of people behind this. So I think I'll break this down really, but I think the main brief that we were given at this beginning was to create something like the National Performance Framework, but for the 4 harms of COVID-19. So there's a bit to kind of get into there. So firstly, the National Performance Framework. So you can Google that, and it should take you to a little site explaining what that is. But it's basically a framework for all of Scotland to create a more successful country. So it's got a range of national outcomes that are sort of illustrated in that picture. I think some people see it as a flower, and some people see it as a cog, like a cog in a wheel. But so the brief was to make something like that, but for the 4 harms of COVID-19. So the 4 harms was a kind of a framework that Scottish Government used to talk about the different ways in which the pandemic was causing harm. So the first one was around the direct health impacts of COVID-19. Then there were health impacts not directly related to COVID-19. So that included things like the impact on services and how people are using those services. There's the societal impacts. So, for example, many people report feeling isolated and anxious, and school closures have affected children's education and well-being. And then there's the economic impacts, so things like unemployment. And really the audience was everybody, because the goal was really to build transparency around some of these decisions and build public engagement. So one of the first things that I did near the beginning of this project was to kind of have a look at what else was being done around COVID-19 and data visualization. And I've got a picture here, kind of an illustration of the Cambrian explosion, because it kind of reminded me of that a little bit. There was just so much work going on in data visualization. So there were charts appearing in government briefings during prime time. There were organizations, the media were trying to get a handle on what this pandemic was, and some were publishing things publicly. There were many private individuals making charts. Some of them were just learning or wanted to get their work seen, and some people wanted to do some public good with that as well. There were people writing articles to track all of the other charts and the other dashboards that were being published. And I remember there was at least one person who wrote an article explaining why they weren't making charts about COVID-19. So there was an awful lot of activity in that part of 2020. And this is just a kind of a taster of the sorts of things we were looking at to see what else was being done, and where Scottish Government would be best placed to add to that. So we've got a few clusters here. At the top left, you've got the media. Places like the Financial Times, I think, were doing some quite innovative data visualization around the beginning of the pandemic. And then at the bottom left, you've got educational institutions. So Johns Hopkins University, I believe, has one of the most viewed dashboards for COVID-19. And that kind of raised a few discussions online about things like use of colour and sort of social responsibility there of using, say red to show information about a pandemic. And then on the top right, we've got some more kind of public sector organisations. So, for example, Public Health Scotland had produced a Tableau dashboard as well. And then on the bottom right, we've got things like private individuals were doing a lot of work around dashboards and COVID-19, and not-for-profit organisations as well. So there's an awful lot going on, and it was kind of sparking quite a lot of discussion about, should we be using log scales? What kind of color is appropriate, and that kind of thing. For us, one of the early decisions was really around tools. So how we were going to build this. I have kind of R is probably my main language that I use. So it was really a decision between R Shiny and R Markdown. And we went for R Markdown because, as far as I know, I don't think it times out in the same way that Shiny can. And in my experience, they've been simpler to maintain as well. And we didn't necessarily need to access APIs or have interactivity that relied on R being run on a server somewhere. And then there was a choice of which R package to use for the data visualization. And in the end, we went with Plotly. And I'm generally kind of pleased with that choice. So it's a nice implementation of grammar of graphics. And it's got a kind of a nice feature where you can translate ggplot2 charts into HTML charts, which we didn't intend to use from the beginning, but it was a useful kind of backup plan in case we needed to do that. I think some of the downsides with Plotly were that I found that the support for small multiples wasn't as good as I'd hoped, and also found that the charts would sort of get stuck if you were scrolling on a touch screen. But very happy to be corrected on any of those in the Q&A afterwards. I'd be really interested if you've had different experiences. Another thing right from the beginning was talking about accessibility. This is probably one of my main kind of recommendations from working on this project, is to start early on something like this. We had a few different resources. So I'd first say, there's guidance available to look at how to get this right. And also there are a number of tools out there. So we used Sally as an automated accessibility checker. And also you can use color contrast analyzer for the contrast of fonts and also the different colors that you're using within the chart itself. If you're lucky enough to have access to an expert, then I definitely recommend using them. We had access to the Scottish Government's Head of Digital Accessibility, which was really useful. So then we started kind of putting together some mock-ups, and this audience is probably really familiar with what you can produce with R Markdown and what maybe a default R Markdown HTML file would look like. But I kind of didn't want to make that assumption that other people in the team would know that. And that's generally something that my team tries to do as much as possible, is to make mock-ups earlier on in a project. Mock-ups are much easier to change than something that you coded up, and it can really help kind of get clarity between multiple people on what something's actually going to look like. During this time, I was kind of experimenting with a few different charts and just looking at what other organizations were producing, such as the BBC. And this was just to get a sense of how we could present these data sets. The bottom row's got a few more experimental charts that we ended up not using, so things like small multiple choropleths. And the very bottom right was a kind of a sort of an illustration of exponential growth. So that was near kind of spring 2020, when there was quite a lot of interest in the R number and whether it was above or below 1. Here's another kind of piece of mock-up that we did, and this fits in with what I was mentioning at the start with the 4 harms. One of the kind of user needs right at the beginning of the brief for this project was being able to take a holistic view of all of these different data sets. So this was kind of an early idea that we started off with these small multiples or spark lines. And those actually, this general design kind of remained. It got a bit tweaked, but we did keep it in the general sense. So this was one of the earlier versions that we started off with. The titles or the y-axis titles, I tried putting those inside the chart itself, and it kind of worked. It kind of didn't. As the data sets were going to get updated quite a lot as well, I decided to go against that because it would probably be a lot of work for every update, changing the coordinates of those bits of text. And yeah, as the mock-up, well, as the dashboard sort of developed, we started kind of having a multiple page layout. So here we've got a kind of there's a sort of an intro to the 4 harms, what those mean, and then a summary so that you can, hopefully see as much of it as possible in one go, and then a more sort of detailed page, which was the kind of original mock-up. At one point, we got it down to 2 pages, but it felt like kind of naturally speaking, there were 3 separate things. So I think we went back to 3 pages in the end. And yeah, and this is I believe this is a screenshot from when it was public, and the page on the far right hasn't changed all that much compared to the original mock-up. The one in the middle is a kind of a summary of the whole thing, and you can see we moved some of the text over to the side so that you could have a very, very brief sort of headline or a little paragraph next to each one. And then the home page is pretty much the same. We originally had a fair chunk of text there, and managed to get that word count down and get the readability score improved as well. But it still felt a little bit like a wall of text. So I added in those 2 kind of pictures in the middle just to break it up and to be links to those other 2 pages. So in terms of how many hits it got, sort of the web analytics, what we've got here, so the COVID dashboard that I'm talking about is the black line, and the grey line was a web page that I picked that would sort of be almost like a baseline, just to give a sense of context. So this is a web page from the National Records of Scotland website, and this was where the weekly COVID deaths data was published, updated each week. So you can see there was quite a number of people going to that web page, especially sort of in the first half of 2020. But over time, I think that the COVID dashboard still has a reasonable number of people. I think it's about 250 visits a day, roughly, which I think is quite a good sort of testament to the value that it's producing, given that, as far as I know, I don't think any brand new data is being published. It's just bringing together data from a number of different sources. I think the response from social media was generally positive. So this is a bit of feedback from someone at Public Health Scotland. I think it's an epidemiologist, I believe. I could be wrong there. But what she's mentioned is that kind of less is more when it comes to data visualization. And I'm really quite pleased with that, because that's something we focused on from the beginning, is to really try and strip away as much as possible so that the data is what kind of shines through. Another piece from social media was this comment on Reddit, and I've picked this out because I've found that the Scotland subreddit in particular is really receptive to this kind of content, and they're really engaged, and they can give some really valuable feedback. So this is a great example of that, and it's something that I think analysts, in my experience, at least in the public sector, could probably make more use of, is reaching out to people on the Scotland subreddit. So yeah, and last slide really is on lessons learned. I think firstly, starting with accessibility early, it's kind of really important, both from a legal point of view, but also just it's kind of the right thing to do as well. We started kind of researching and doing mock-ups very early in the project as well, and I think it's important to kind of look out to see what else is there. So again, in the questions after this, I'd be really interested to know if you know of any other kind of interesting work going in this space, because I'll definitely have blind spots with that. And then making mock-ups early as well. I found that kind of being involved in a few different dashboard bits of work, it really pays to have a mock-up early on, because it can be quite easy to assume that other people have the same thing in mind as you do, but a mock-up can really kind of bottom that out quite quickly. Choosing tools carefully. I think that R Markdown was still the right choice, and with Plotly, happy to chat about that in the questions and answers after this as well, about some of the other options and maybe what I would have chosen if I were to do it now. Number 4 is around Markdown. So the dashboard ingests a spreadsheet basically, and most of the tabs on that spreadsheet are data sets, but there's one tab for all of the narrative and the titles. And we kind of decided early on to have a go at letting people add Markdown into that spreadsheet. So there was a bit of a risk there that people would maybe have a bit of difficulty, if they wanted to add a link, knowing whether they needed a round bracket or a square bracket. But I think once people got used to it, and once they had something existing that they could update, it worked really well. So yeah, that quite pleased with that. And then yeah, seeking feedback from outside of your bubble. So I think getting feedback from people on Reddit was a good example of that. But always aware that we all have blind spots, and there might be other places. So do let me know if you know of any other communities or networks that might be interested in this sort of thing. And then I've intentionally repeated the first bullet just to say that yeah, it really pays to work on accessibility early on. This meant that we could put together an accessibility statement in good time, and it can be tempting to sort of leave it until the last minute and view it as a kind of a tick box exercise, but it's really worth kind of thinking about that early on. Yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. This was extremely interesting, and I feel I can definitely echo your first and last point there about starting accessibility early. That will save a lot of work and help building up something more robust and inaccessible. Okay, so we do have quite a lot of questions from the audience and from ourselves, actually. So I'd give the ball to Greg, who's going to read them out. And thanks again, Joseph and Andrews, for your talks. Greg.
Thanks, Philly, and thanks both our speakers. They were fantastic. And you can probably hear my children in the background because they're very noisy. So yeah, let's kick into the questions. I think I'm going to start with one that goes to both of you so that we don't have to argue over who goes first. So the question from Mike was, how do you handle collaboration between the teams? Was that both the speakers? No, it's here. When do we use an email? When should we use a dashboard? That was the question for both of you. There's a blurry line there, right? So I'll start with Andrew. What's your feeling on where the line lies?
Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky one. I mean, I like the fact that if you're sending people an email, it doesn't require them to actually be proactive. It pops up in their inbox, and inevitably they'll get there. They might delete it, they may ignore it, but at least the content has been delivered. With the dashboard, you actually need to sort of encourage them to visit your site, which is maybe just another step, which is potentially not going to be done by many people. So in terms of engagement, maybe email has an advantage.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that. Joseph, you've obviously built dashboards here. Do you have a different feeling?
Yeah, can I get, I forgot the right question. So is this about email versus dashboards?
Yeah, that's right, exactly. So where would you say the line lies between the two?
I think, I guess it's kind of stating the obvious with this project. It was really about building transparency between, a government and its citizens. So I guess I don't really see how email could work in that case. A dashboard very much. But yeah, it can be tricky if you're talking about collaboration with everybody, then that's a kind of a dashboard thing, you can put to a URL. If you're talking about internally where things need to be kind of secure or whatever, then I guess that's where an email shines. And the tricky spot is the kind of the gray area in between, where you might want to restrict access to some organizations or that kind of thing. And yeah, no easy answers to that one, but
yeah, it's fair enough. Okay, I think quite a lot of your questions, Andrew, have been answered in chat already. So I'm gonna give Joe some of the limelight here. Starting with some of the hopefully simpler ones. I'm sorry for the main road outside my window. Not having a good night tonight. The web analytics, they're very spiky. Were there particularly, could you identify why those spikes were coming from? Was that like people accessing it on publication days and then dropping off again? Was there a particular pattern?
Yeah, there's two main things. So the main source of spikiness is that I think it was updated once or twice a week. So people got used to when it got updated. The other, more of a kind of a macro feature in the web analytics was when I think it was in October 2020 when the First Minister kind of mentioned that Public Health Scotland's dashboard had been either updated or created, but she mentioned it publicly, and that kind of coincided with a quite big spike in web analytics for that dashboard. So yeah, I think if the First Minister mentions something, that will often drive traffic.
For sure. And Chris asks about the writing and the narrative. Do the people writing the narrative also use version control along with the rest of the team? Because that seems like quite a win if you're getting them to use Markdown.
Yeah, so I guess this is a bit specific to Scottish Government. Our files management system has version control built in. So we had a spreadsheet that had sort of historical snapshots, which was quite handy. Whether it's version control as you would think of it, things like Git or something, it's probably not that. But so people weren't, doing git commit or anything. They were just opening up a spreadsheet.
Sure. I mean, any version control is better than none, right? Okay, one more for Joe, and then I think another couple for Andrew maybe. So Sally looks like an interesting package. How does that work? Is that sort of fully automated? Is there some upfront work you need to do with it?
I think it's a web browser extension. So if you Google that, I think it's 2 number 1s instead of the L's, and I think you can drag that onto your browser taskbar or something like that. And what it does is you go to a website and you click on it as a bookmark, and then it will visually highlight certain accessibility issues like missing alt tag. What I found it particularly useful for, which is just a really basic thing, was making sure that your H tags step down properly from H1 to H2 to H3. So it will show you the outline visually, which is it sounds like quite a basic thing, and it is, I suppose, but it's a very easy way to check that your H tags are in order. So yeah, I definitely recommend it, and I don't think it involves installing anything.
Super, thanks for that. Come back to Andrew then. I'm going to give you the spicy one, I think. There's quite a few packages for email in R already. What are you? I'll give you the nice version. What are your strengths, do you think, for email Ely? Where does it do well? Or what's the comparison, I guess, is the more neutral question.
Yeah, so as I think I mentioned during the course of my talk, one of the objectives for us was to ensure that it didn't have any particularly demanding dependencies. So some of the other email packages are a little bit onerous, can be onerous to install because some of the dependencies are tricky, RJava being one of them. The other is that we've tried to make sure that we have this kind of tidyverse compliant syntax available, which means that, our functions and methods work nicely with the pipe. And I think we're also trying to build in some functionality that is not available in other packages. Like I particularly like the parties method, where I can get a table of all the people involved on an email, which I think is pretty handy. And we certainly have used that quite extensively. So the feature that we're going to be talking about tomorrow and probably releasing on Friday, I think is going to be probably one of the biggest selling points of the package, but I'm reticent to give that game away right now. Come back to the Birmingham meetup tomorrow evening, and you'll find out.
Seems fair. No, I really like that tidyverse approach. I can really see value in being able to add extra columns of metadata of different groups within your organization and so on, and then filtering for recipients. That's something. So I use Blastular at the moment, and it really doesn't handle that well, right? You have to set up all your recipients way in advance, and it's just like a string. I think we've got time for one more. Let's pick up. I know you've already answered a couple in chat. So, Joe, how would you compare to Traveling Tabby? The latter is pretty awesome, right? But I think they do a lot of it manually. And as Mike points out, this is Mike's question, that sounds really painful.
Yeah, I've not been in touch with Traveling Tabby, so I don't really know what their workflow is. But I'm just looking at it now, and I think the first thing that strikes me is it looks more like a kind of what you'd imagine as a traditional dashboard. So it's got these kind of modular boxes with maps and charts and things. I think that the main thing that the Scottish Government dashboard focused on was really the narrative that kind of goes with the charts and with the data. So each paragraph that sits, above or below a chart has been kind of written quite carefully by the relevant statistician, and we tried to put kind of word limits on those so that it's concise, but a kind of considered set of caveats. So that's probably where the Scottish Government had a bit of value to add there, and probably the other difference is I think Traveling Tabby is quite a lot more active on social media than I am, and engage with people a lot. And it's clearly a really popular, really valuable dashboard.
Thanks for that. Okay, I think we're out of time at that point. There are definitely more questions being answered in chat. On the point of chat, I will remind everyone again that the chat continues on Matrix in perpetuation because it's a permanent thing. I would highly recommend anyone watching the stream on the recording to come join us and find us and join in the chat. I will also add that there is a wider R ecosystem that I'm trying to build up on Matrix as well. So if you come into the EdinbR channel, ask me, Ken Gilvin, I will point you in the right directions there. But there's an R language channel and a news channel and so on. So thanks very much to the speakers. Oh, one last point. If you think Matrix is going to be something that you will infrequently use, it is capable of emailing you notifications. Go into your settings, enable the email, and then when I do @room in EdinbR to tell you the next session's coming, you'll get a notify about it. Thanks very much, folks.
Okay, thank you, Craig. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Joseph. And thanks, everyone, for attending. And remember that we are always on the lookout for new speakers for our sessions. In particular, we are starting to think about a series of themed meetups in the future. And one of the first one to come up will be related to working with R to tackle climate change and sustainability issues. So if there's any person that would be interested in speak to us all about their work in that field, they would be very much welcome to get in touch. Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Mike. The behind the curtains kept everything together, and we'll see you next month. Goodbye. Cheers.